It is a common scenario in many organizations. A meeting concludes with what appears to be unanimous agreement on a new plan, but when weeks pass, no action has been taken. This outcome is often mistaken for a failure of execution. The reality, however, is that it points to a systemic illusion. The core issue is not a failure to manage disagreement, but a failure to recognize that the agreement itself was never real.
A decision is presented to a team. As each member is asked for their input, they voice their approval. The result is an apparent consensus, creating the impression of clear, universal support for the path forward. Yet, despite this initial agreement, the planned actions do not occur. This leads to a fundamental contradiction, a situation where unanimous consent results in complete inaction. In this sense, the system is functioning as designed, though not toward the outcome that was publicly stated.
To understand this paradox, it is necessary to examine a common assumption about group decisions. This assumption can be described as the agreement trap.
The common belief is that the primary goal and the most difficult hurdle in any group process is reaching consensus. It is assumed that once agreement is achieved, collective action will simply follow as a natural next step.
This assumption, however, rests on a critical premise. What happens if the public agreement is not real? What if it is an illusion that masks the true private beliefs of the individuals involved?
The origin of this illusion is not found in the group dynamic itself. Instead, it begins with a silent, internal calculation made by each individual member of the group.
A key mechanism driving this behavior is psychological inertia. This term describes the tendency to maintain the current state, or status quo, unless there is a strong motivation to change. Consequently, inaction becomes the default path, not because it is an active choice, but because a sufficient motive to act is missing.
In this context, each person privately weighs their options. On one hand, they have their own reservations about the plan. On the other, they face the perceived social risk of voicing dissent. When they observe others remaining silent, they interpret that silence as agreement. This leads them to conclude that their concerns are unique and that speaking up would be seen as disruptive.
This calculation creates a strong incentive to avoid creating conflict. To preserve social harmony and avoid being perceived as uncooperative, individuals often choose to suppress their private doubts and publicly conform to what they believe is the group's opinion.
When this same private calculation is made by multiple individuals within the group, their collective silence produces a powerful and misleading dynamic. This is often described as a consensus of none. This phenomenon is called pluralistic ignorance. It describes a situation where each person observes the behavior of others, in this case their silence, and misinterprets it as genuine agreement. This reinforces the individual's mistaken belief that their own private doubts are unique, even when many others in the group are feeling the exact same way.
The result is a self-reinforcing cycle known as the spiral of silence. It begins when an individual's fear of being an outlier leads them to remain silent. This silence is then observed and misinterpreted by others as agreement. As more people remain silent, the perception of consensus grows, eventually solidifying into the group's official but ultimately false view.
The central issue, therefore, is not a failure to manage disagreement within the group. Rather, it is a failure to manage an agreement that was never authentic. The group ends up managing a shared perception of consensus, instead of the actual, diverse opinions of its members.
This psychological dynamic does not happen in isolation. It is often amplified and reinforced by forces within the organization's structure. This structural influence can be thought of as organizational inertia.
Organizational inertia describes the tendency for an organization to remain unchanged. Established routines, familiar processes, and existing power structures all contribute to a natural resistance against significant change, effectively pulling the system toward its current state.
Several structural factors can drive this inertia. These include layered hierarchies, separate departmental silos, rigid internal processes, and an organizational fear of failure. Each of these elements makes change appear more difficult or risky, which in turn reinforces the individual's calculation that silence is the safer choice.
As a result, the design of the organization itself can create a strong pull toward inaction. It makes maintaining the status quo an easier and safer path for individuals than advocating for proactive change.
When this false consensus at the individual level combines with the broader pull of organizational inertia, the outcome is predictable. This outcome can be understood as the inevitable consequences of inaction.
The lack of change that follows is not an accident. It is a logical outcome of a system in which a perception of agreement masks widespread private doubt, while structural barriers simultaneously discourage any real forward movement.
Over time, this inaction leads to tangible, negative consequences for the organization. For example, innovation can stagnate because new ideas are not genuinely debated. Inefficiency may rise, as outdated processes are left unchallenged. And eventually, talented employees may choose to leave, frustrated by a culture that resists change.
It is important to recognize that this is a systemic condition, not simply a failure of individuals or teams. The system itself is often structured to optimize for social harmony and stability, even if that comes at the expense of progress.
Ultimately, the entire structure, from individual psychology up to organizational design, is aligned to maintain stability. The system is designed to prioritize the avoidance of social risk over the pursuit of optimal decisions and effective action.